Upon closer examination, Brazil and India share striking similarities. The government tends to adopt a laissez-faire approach, and the societal divide is starkly apparent. In Brazil, the wealthiest 1% control over 50% of the nation's wealth. These affluent individuals live in upscale neighborhoods, work in high-profit industries such as mining, oil, water resources, and government positions, and enjoy 24/7 private armed security. Conversely, over 50 million people in Brazil live in extreme poverty. They inhabit areas characterized by wooden shacks and makeshift slums. Children grow up amid gang violence and drug dealing, with their daily routines revolving around playing soccer and stealing. If they don't become professional soccer players as they mature, they are highly likely to join gangs or drug trafficking organizations. In Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, there is a famous mountain called Corcovado, where a 38-meter-tall statue of Jesus stands with open arms. The statue faces the affluent neighborhoods of Brazil, while the slums lie behind it. This accurately reflects Brazilian society. Once part of the renowned BRIC countries and known for the Brazilian miracle, let's examine how resource-rich Brazil has managed to dig itself into a hole. When the Portuguese arrived in South America in the 16th century, they discovered a region abundant with a type of tree called Brazilwood. Consequently, they named the area Brazil. At that time, Brazil was inhabited by indigenous tribes. The Portuguese used force to compel these indigenous people to mine and cultivate sugarcane. As production capacity expanded, a labor shortage became evident. Since the indigenous population was difficult to control, the Portuguese began to import labor from Africa, eventually establishing a constitutional monarchy ruled by the Portuguese royal family, the Brazilian Empire. In 1889, the Brazilian Empire collapsed, and the country transitioned from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. The nobles, landowners, and merchants from the former empire adapted their identities and monopolized much of the society's wealth in the name of the state. These individuals gradually infiltrated the government system, using bribery to protect their wealth and maintain power. During World War II, while the Eurasian continent was suffering heavily from the conflict, Brazil not only remained unscathed but also seized the opportunity to undergo an economic transformation. The Brazilian president at the time, Getúlio Vargas, was a populist dictator who maintained a discreet relationship with Nazi Germany. This is one of the main reasons why many high-ranking Nazi officials fled to Brazil after the war. The combination of dictatorship and populism was a hallmark of that era. During Vargas's 18-year rule, he implemented a series of modernization reforms in Brazil. Land reform. The redistribution of land from wealthy landowners to the people facilitated the construction of roads and factories. Promoting public education, ensuring the population had basic cultural knowledge and literacy, enabling them to work in factories and understand instruction manuals. State-led industrial development. In 1940, Vargas introduced Brazil's first five-year plan, with the government overseeing the country's economic activities. He also established two state-owned steel companies. These actions might seem familiar, as Vargas was essentially adopting the Soviet model, a common strategy for many developing countries at the time. Vargas's reforms yielded positive results, with Brazil's industrial output increasing by over 40% in just a few years. Had this trajectory continued, Brazil would have become a formidable industrial power. Unfortunately, in 1954, Vargas was forced to take his own life by the military, and Juscelino Kubitschek, a Czech descendant, became the president. Kubitschek continued Vargas's path of industrialization, and during his five-year tenure, Brazil's industrial output grew by 80%. Steel production doubled, the power and communication industries surged by 380%, and road traffic increased sixfold. This period is often referred to as Brazil's Golden Age. However, this growth was more a product of a unique historical era rather than sustainable development. After World War II, there was a global shortage of materials, and Brazil capitalized on this by exporting a wave of industrial products. However, as countries around the world began to recover and resume production, Brazil's economy started to face problems. Since Vargas's era, Brazil had focused on a state-owned economy, which initially allowed it to concentrate resources on major projects. When the market was good, many issues were overlooked, such as low efficiency, high costs, and products not keeping up with market demands, common problems faced by state-owned enterprises worldwide. When industrial powerhouses like the United States regained their strength and produced an abundance of low-cost industrial products, Brazil's exports took a heavy hit. As American products entered Brazil, not only were the heavy industries like steel affected, but even light industries such as footwear and clothing were also heavily impacted by American goods. For the average Brazilian, imported products offered better quality and lower prices, leaving little reason to buy domestically produced goods. Brazil was quite lenient with its trade policies at the time, with virtually no barriers to entry. By opening its doors, Brazil let in a flood of foreign competition, which ultimately led to economic stagnation. As a result, the country's trade deficit continued to grow. In 1964, the military government took power in Brazil. At that time, the trade deficit had become extremely severe. The Brazilian government could only survive by borrowing and printing money. Eventually, the military government could no longer sit idly by, so they came up with a grand strategy of import substitution. This strategy first limited the import of certain primary products. Then, it attracted foreign investment to build factories in Brazil under favorable conditions. In this way, primary products went from being imported to domestically produced. Next, the tax revenues from these foreign-owned factories and some fiscal income were invested in the national economy and local enterprises. This increased the purchasing power of the citizens and supported the growth of domestic businesses. Lastly, this model was gradually expanded from primary industries to medium and high-end industries in order to achieve the import substitution strategy. The Brazilian government began implementing this strategy in 1968. In the first 5 years, Brazil's annual GDP growth exceeded 11%. However, by the 1970s, this model was no longer sustainable. Firstly, the external environment underwent drastic changes. In 1973, the first oil crisis broke out, causing a significant increase in industrial costs. This dealt a heavy blow to Brazil's manufacturing industry, and a large amount of foreign capital exited the market. Secondly, the Brazilian government's fiscal revenue declined substantially, making it difficult to continue with subsidy policies. The problem was that the Brazilian people had grown accustomed to high welfare policies, and if the government stopped distributing money, the people could easily become agitated. In order to cope with the fiscal deficit, the Brazilian military government had no choice but to print money recklessly. As a result, Brazil's inflation rate skyrocketed to 15%. Even more embarrassingly at that time, Brazil's domestic enterprises had not yet completed their transformation. Equipment had only been upgraded halfway when the government subsidies disappeared, leading to the collapse of numerous factories. Moreover, this period coincided with the golden age of the 4 Asian tigers. Workers from the Confucian cultural sphere were both cheap and hard-working. The production efficiency and labor intensity of East Asian factories were unmatched by Brazil. Consequently, Brazil's economic opportunities were snatched away by Asian competitors, and the country missed the window for profiting from industrialization. In 1985, the military government stepped down, leaving Brazil's economy in a deplorable state. The average annual GDP growth was less than 3%. Per capita income had fallen by 6%, and the proportion of foreign capital had dropped from 24% to 16%. The import substitution strategy had failed completely. Entering the 1990s, Brazil's inflation rate once soared to nearly 2,500%, rendering its currency virtually worthless. Under these circumstances, radical reformists came to power and subsequently implemented a series of economic reform measures. The Brazilian president at the time, Cardoso, summarized his economic theory as trusting the power of the market. Cardoso's economic reforms closely resembled those of Yeltsin during the same period, both drawing upon Western liberal market economic theories. He lowered tariffs, sold off state-owned assets, carried out large-scale privatization, reduced subsidies, and pegged the currency directly to the US dollar. However, after all of Cardoso's efforts, Brazil's economy did not see any significant improvements. Instead, a number of economic oligarchs emerged. These individuals colluded with government officials during the privatization process and quickly gained control over lucrative industries such as oil, mining, and electricity. Moreover, Cardoso's luck wasn't particularly good. Just as the economy was showing signs of recovery, the 1998 Asian financial crisis struck, and Brazil was affected as well. As a result, the financial records of Cardoso's government looked quite bleak, and Cardoso was eventually ousted by the left-wing party in 2002. When the left-wing president Lula took office, his primary concern was to address unemployment and ensure the survival of low-income populations. His method of solving these problems was quite simple, using the same money printing approach that the previous military government had employed, which had ultimately ruined the country. Lula was certainly aware of this history and knew very well that the military government's money printing approach had an inherent flaw. Industrialization is, by nature, a process of intensive capital appreciation, with each stage requiring vast amounts of funds. For example, if the owner of a small workshop wants to grow into a publicly listed company, they need to continuously invest their earnings in expanding production, similar to rolling a snowball. However, this process is incredibly painful, and if external conditions turn unfavorable, the investment may be lost entirely. Back in the day, the military government was subsidizing both enterprises and the public. During times of favorable market conditions, the national finances could barely support these subsidies. But when the oil crisis hit, and their own industries hadn't yet developed, the country eventually ended up with nothing. The question then is how to achieve high returns with minimal investment, allowing for the distribution of funds without causing a fiscal collapse. Lula's answer was to sell minerals. Brazil is indeed rich in mineral resources, with over 30 types of mineral reserves ranking among the world's top. Among these, the iron ore reserves amount to over 30 billion tons, accounting for 9.8% of the world's total and ranking second in production. Brazil's bauxite reserves are 4.55 million tons, accounting for over 90% of the world's total. There are also hundreds of other lesser-known mineral reserves. In short, the country is incredibly rich in resources. Since these abundant mineral resources could not subsidize domestic industries, it made sense to sell them instead. Starting in 2005, Brazil began to expand its mineral resource exports. Iron ore production alone increased by 45%, with export revenues exceeding $30 billion. Additionally, Lula's personal luck was truly good. Brazil discovered oil fields off its coastline and then experienced a booming oil market. Relying on mineral and crude oil exports, the Brazilian government reaped substantial profits. This not only alleviated foreign debt and fiscal deficits, but also quickly propelled Brazil to become the world's seventh largest economy. During Lula's 8-year term, the Brazilian government distributed money like crazy. 20 million low-income people were quickly lifted out of poverty, and foreign exchange reserves reached a peak of $300 billion. As resource sales led to prosperity, no one seemed concerned about the shrinking manufacturing industry. While the Brazilian people enjoyed high welfare, they turned a blind eye to the government's blatant corruption. During the years when oil prices were soaring, reaching over $100 per barrel, Brazil behaved like a nouveau riche. It aggressively invested capital throughout South America, from power plants in the Dominican Republic to dams in Angola and subway lines in Venezuela. Brazilian capital could be seen everywhere. However, due to a lack of experience, Brazilian capital rushed in blindly, only to withdraw just as quickly when conditions changed. In the process, they left behind a vast amount of debt contracts. Before 2008, Brazil's annual growth rate exceeded 6%, and Goldman Sachs labeled Brazil as one of the BRIC countries. However, the 2008 global financial crisis caused a sharp decline in mineral and oil prices, leaving Brazil once again with nothing. Surprisingly, the country's economy experienced negative growth. The Brazilian model quickly became a cautionary tale, and the BRIC countries were mentioned less frequently from then on. Up to now, Brazil has not yet emerged from the shadow of the 2008 crisis, with its GDP hovering between 1% and 2%. Despite this, Brazilian politicians still did not give up on promising high welfare policies to the public, though they fulfilled these promises less and less frequently.